Hello, my name is Amy Natsky. Welcome to my channel. For the past several months, I've been taking a break from reading the texts, and instead I've been discussing Christian mysticism. If you'd like to see some of the previous videos I've done on this, look for the playlist here at the channel called Considering Christian Mysticism, and I hope you'll have a look. I'm still thinking about things that characterize the mystics, and there are three attitudes that they share that come to mind. One is the attitude toward the self, then toward suffering, then toward our neighbor. And as you might expect, these run counter to the prevailing attitudes that we have in the world, for the most part, to these things today. Also, they're attitudes practiced by untold numbers of people, hidden throughout the life of the church, and still today, who are never going to get around to being called mystics or saints or anything like that. But in the lives of the mystics, we can observe these attitudes as they're full-blown and visible, and we can study them. So in this video, I'll talk about the attitude toward the self. The mystics understood the self as something to be entirely surrendered to God, and this is an attitude that's very clear in Jesus' own life and teaching, and it's also fully supported in the rest of the New Testament. Here are some of the words that sit at the heart of the mystics' understanding. Truly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. John chapter 12. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Luke chapter 9. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. Mark 8. And then the words of Paul, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loves me and gave himself for me. Galatians 2:20. And then finally, in a nutshell, Colossians 3:3. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. Johannes Thaler, from the late medieval era, put it this way. Whoever wishes to have all the fruit of life must suffer all manner of death. This selling means the self-denial of man. The following of Christ is fundamentally to die, so that by dying completely to himself, God may live perfectly in him. Now, sometimes the mystics do make this confusing for us by the language that they use. Here's an example of a passage that has some of this language in it. The soul must be stripped of everything, of its own spiritual experiences, its own virtues, its own sense of progress. This must be if it is to be clothed in God alone. This stripping is death to self, and it is the only way to true union. The soul must consent to be nothing, to have nothing, to know nothing, to feel nothing, so that God may be all. Now, lots of us will get tripped up by the idea of the soul being nothing. And sometimes I have a hard time reading words like this on the channel. I trust the mystics, I know where they're going, but the words get a little bit stuck in my throat because I suspect that there could be listeners who find it dismaying or very confusing because of a place of healing that they might be in. Maybe there's someone who doesn't have a sense of what a self is, or that it's okay to be a self. And then this becomes very delicate terrain. I'd like to share three observations of my own that have helped me through these junctures, first of understanding better what the death to self is, and then also the question of these confusing, off-putting extremes that we may observe in other people or ourselves. The first of these is that we can observe that people who are irresistibly drawn to Christ come to him with great needs and complexities within themselves already. It's their needs that are driving them to him, and it was very much this way with the great heroes of the faith. They struggled also tremendously, especially in their youth. But it's these things in them and in us that cause us, that motivate us to seek after God and what he offers. So the way that we respond to Jesus and his words is going to reflect where we are in these things. The way we hear the words, the way they land on us, what we do with them, all of that will get reflected through those same foibles and severities. They don't stay hidden. If we're serious about God, they don't stay hidden. They will get drawn to the surface, and they will have to be reckoned with. If we will look for this in the mystics, we'll really be able to take heart. Because we'll see, as we examine that arc of their lives, we'll see that God is meeting them in those needs gently. And we'll see how, over time, in that hidden place where they meet him and decide to trust him, he is working to transform them. The chaff is painfully exposed, but he's drawing out the wheat, and if they'll stay in the game, if they stay in the process, then that chaff does gradually fall away. And as God does this, and of course he's never in a hurry, there's plenty of time for us to discover him in his nature, for us to be more and more assured of who he is. We discover him to be someone that we can approach with simplicity and with ease, and this soothes us and puts things in order. Brother Lawrence says this: I regard myself as the most wretched of all men, stinking and covered with sores, and as one who has committed all sorts of crimes against his king. Overcome by remorse, I confess all my wickedness to him. I ask his pardon and abandon myself entirely to him to do with as he will. But this king, filled with goodness and mercy, far from chastising me, lovingly embraces me. He makes me eat at his table. He serves me with his own hands, gives me the keys of his treasures, and treats me as his favorite. He talks with me and is delighted with me in 1,001 ways. He forgives me and relieves me of my principal bad habits without talking about them. So this is a recurring theme in the mystics, discovering the nature of God. This discovery is part of their transformation. And as it happens, their behavior, their words become attractive to others and to us. It's nourishing. It doesn't confuse or put us off anymore. So the second observation I have is that over the past several centuries, the way that we think about the concept of self has changed. The way we're culturally oriented to it has changed. Since the Enlightenment, what is called the self has been isolated and objectified in a way that had never had been before. So our language has developed in a way that expresses that, and much of that language that we use in talking about the self just didn't exist before that period. If we follow that trajectory forward through the centuries and examine the fallout of it, we can see that now, at least in the West, it's harder and harder to hear language about self-denial or that death to self without feeling that we're betraying or injuring some essential part of who we are as a human being. But again, that implication just wasn't around for most of the life of the church. Now, Jesus' words about self-denial have always been difficult. They've always been unpopular, but they haven't always triggered a kind of existential fear or confusion or paralysis. Knowing this has guided me as I go back to the original words of Jesus and ask, what is it that he meant? What is it I can know in myself that he's speaking to? And what is that piece in each of us that transcends those changes that have occurred over time in how we talk or think about the self? And that in turn then helps me go back and rethink and reevaluate those awkward phrases that I may read in the mystics. Now the third observation comes in considering the language of adoration that we hear from the mystics. We hear them in their adoration of God, grasping for words and metaphors to express what they come to see and know of him. And that language is reflecting a more and more sustained and marvelous vision of him in his greatness, in his glory, and in the immense love that he has for them. From that place, then, we could say that the relative weight of themselves before God is changing. And it's easier to understand from that angle how they want to be lost in God or overtaken by him. And that's how then they get to that language of annihilation or being nothing before God. This is described by Jonathan Edwards, the American revivalist preacher born in 1703. He had a truly mystical bent about him. He said, "The person of Christ appeared ineffably excellent, with an excellency great enough to swallow up all thought and conception. I felt an ardency of soul to be emptied and annihilated, to lie in the dust and be full of Christ alone, to love him with a holy and pure love, to trust in him, to live upon him, to serve and follow him, and to be totally wrapped up in the fullness of Christ." Another way to consider it is that as the mystics are desiring God more and more, they don't want to present anything in resistance to who he is or what he's offering them of himself. They don't want to be in the way. The great medieval mystic Meister Eckhart has a good illustration of this. He says, "If therefore the heart is to be in a state of preparedness to receive the all-highest, then it must rest in nothingness, and that offers the greatest of all possibilities. Since the detached heart is at the highest point, then it must rest in nothingness, for that is where the greatest receptivity exists. Let me draw an analogy from nature," he says. "If I wish to write on a wax tablet, then whatever has already been written on it, however noble it may be, prevents me from writing on it. And if I wish to do so, then I must first erase whatever is on it. The tablet is never better for writing on than when it is clean. It's exactly the same with God, who, if he wishes to write in the highest way on my heart, must first remove everything from my heart, whatever can be called this or that, so that he's left with a detached heart. Then God can work within it in the highest way and according to his highest will." So standing back, if we're looking at the arc of these very non-static lives of the mystics, we see that the essential self is not lost, but it comes to flourish as it is occupied by God through the Holy Spirit. And as the mystics encounter God, and as they realize and discover his nature, their desires, their inclinations, and their values are transformed. They're changed. And their agency is realized continually in the conscious choice they make to be emptied for God's sake. So thank you for listening. In the next few videos, I will talk about the attitude towards suffering and toward our neighbor, and we'll see how all three of these are then braided together in the basic virtue of humility.